Hi everyone, my name is Noon from Sound Particles, and the idea today is to do a video version of the manual of SkyDust 3D. So we have the manual that you can read regarding every single parameter of SkyDust. Nonetheless, there are people that don't like read manuals or they prefer a more visual kind of approach. So the idea is, let's do a video. Yes, it's going to be a big video, but let's talk about every single parameter, every single knob of SkyDust. And then on the description, you can go to this description of the video to jump directly to the sections of the multiple areas and panels of SkyDust. And let's talk about every single parameter of SkyDust. First, let's talk about this top bar over here. So in here we have this indicator that is going to flash every time that I receive any kind of MIDI information, or if I'm playing the sustain pedal or the pitch bend or something like that. So, and the idea here is to help you troubleshooting some situations. Imagine that, okay, you have instantiated SkyDust, but you don't get any sound. Okay, is the problem regarding SkyDust, or is the problem that you are not able to send MIDI information to here? So this helps a lot. If this is not blinking, means that you are not receiving, SkyDust is not receiving any kind of MIDI information, and of course that can help you find the cause of the problem. Then we have the zoom. So most of the times we have this like 100%. Okay, eventually you may want to do something smaller because you want multiple views of multiple instances of SkyDust from different tracks always at the same time, or eventually imagine, no, I want the largest possible screen available, so you can increase this. Also, if you want, you can also use the drag and drop on the bottom right corner. And also, if you want to have this set as default. So by default, when you open the SkyDust editor, it's going to open always at 100%. If you want that from now on, every time that I open SkyDust, to start having this size, because it's always the size that I want for my screen, you can set as default, and from this moment on, if you place a new track with the SkyDust there, you open the editor, and now the editor is going to have the desired size that you want. Then we have the dice, and the dice is random preset. So of course people like a lot of presets to choose the right sound. Well, what we have implemented at SkyDust is a random preset generator, that every time that you press here on this dice, it's going to give you a random sound, a random preset. Okay, and yeah, sometimes you want, it's going to give you a more musical kind of preset, sometimes a more sound design kind of preset. Once again, simply press here, and every time that you press, you're going to get a different kind of preset. Internally, what is going to happen? Well, around 15% of the times we're going to select one existing preset that already exists. Then around 15% of the times it's going to combine multiple sub-presets. We're going to talk about sub-presets in a moment. But say, okay, let's combine this preset of Spatial with this preset of Arpeggiator and this preset of FEM and this preset of filters, and combine all of these sub-presets to create something new. But then around 70% of the times, what is going to happen is that is going to create completely from scratch a new preset. Of course, it's not simply random values, because that would mean most of the times a very crappy kind of preset. So we have fine-tuned this preset generator, random preset generator, to make sure that you get interesting sounds every time that you press here. And once again, sometimes you get presets that you like, sometimes you get the diamond in the rough. It could be a fantastic one, and that one additional tweaking here and tweaking there, and you get a fantastic sound. So if you are looking for new sounds that no one else is using, simply press here, preset generator, roll the dice and see what luck will give you in terms of preset. When you're doing this, you can actually see there is here this menu where you can lock certain parts of the random generator, which means that imagine, for instance, okay, I really like the timbre that I'm getting from the synth, but to give me a different spatial kind of movement. Okay, so imagine this. Okay, let's lock arpeggiator, pitch, and let's lock also timbre, but only get spatial, which means that, for instance, I come here and say, okay, I have this. Okay, random, give me a different spatial movement, or give me a different spatial movement, and you get, every time that you press, you're going to get a different kind of movement. So every time that you press there, it's going to change, but only the spatial component. Of course, if you want to change everything, simply leave everything out, and then every time that you press, you're going to have a random preset coming out of it. Then we have here the things that allow you to navigate between presets. Of course, you can move, come here and say, okay, let's move back and forward. Okay, anytime that you are in some kind of project, if you press here, you go into the main panel with this expanded to allow you to select whatever preset you want. If imagine that you are doing some changes and you want to save this, okay, you simply going to save, and now it's going to tell, okay, this broken, it's already been used as a preset name, so okay, let's use something else. You name your new preset, you say, okay, the octave, okay, it's me, and then you select the kind of things that you are looking. So no, this is, let me keep this as a string kind of preset or whatever, for me to then more easily find the preset that I'm generating. So I'm cancel it, I not want to save this now. Then we have the output. So by default, when you instantiate SkyDust on a track, it pretty much knows which track it is. Imagine this, okay, it's stereo, or this is 5.1, or this 7.1.2, okay? Nonetheless, there are several things or several situations where you want to come here and change things. One of them is, imagine that you want to change to a different stereo, because you can have multiple flavors of stereo. For people that usually mix songs, okay, different stereos, I think there were only one stereo. Well, for instance, when you are recording something using stereo techniques, you use different stereo techniques like XY, middle X, middle side, the Deca tree, among other things. So, and each one of these recordings is going to give you slightly different variations in terms of the sound image. The same thing happens here. So when you change between different flavors of stereo, you're going to have multiple variations. Let me give you an example. Imagine that the sound is located over here, okay, above on the left speaker. Okay, do you want the right speaker to have any kind of signal, or want the right signal to be completely muted because everything, the sound is clearly on the left speaker? Or imagine something in the back. Do you want something in the back to be slightly attenuated because it's in the back and we are only reproducing in stereo? Or you want the back to have the same full volume? So a lot of things like this are taken into consideration. So spend some time, if you work with SkyDust mainly in stereo, come here and change between different settings of stereo, because you're going to have slightly different variations in terms of stereo. Also, sometimes you have a stereo track, but actually what you want is to use binaural, which means 3D sound over headphones. So imagine that you are creating something. You know that this is going to be used for a situation where people will only listen to this with headphones, so you want to use binaural. Or imagine that you want to do something in Dolby Atmos, but you are on your laptop at home and you want to play with Dolby Atmos, but you only have headphones, so you use binaural to get this 3D sound over headphones. Of course, there is other flavors here. For instance, 4.0, imagine that you are doing a live concert. Yes, you have your main speakers in front of the stage, but imagine, okay, let's have an additional pair of speakers in the back of the audiences, and now you get a 4.0, and when you play, the audience will get the sound moving around, and it's a quite rewarding experience for the audience during your live concert. Of course, we have 5.1, 7.1.2 and many other things over here that you can select. As you can see, we have more than 30 output formats on the system that you can select. In this case, I have a 7.1.2, which means that this track only has 10 channels. That's why these formats are disabled, because on this track you cannot use this because you would need much more channels to be able to use 6 ordered ambisonics or 22.2 and other things, but nonetheless we have all of these channels available. Also, some interesting information. When you talk about 5.1 and 7.1, what SkyDust does is it doesn't send any kind of information for the LFE, and there is a reason for that. A lot of people confuse LFE with the subwoofer. Okay, so LFE, it's something that we should use for low frequency effects, not to send the regular bass there. Okay, of course, if you have a studio with a subwoofer, you should have some kind of bass management to make sure that the subwoofer reproduces the frequencies, the bass frequencies, low frequencies that the speakers are not able to reproduce. Okay, but in terms of creation, what you should do is LFE is something that should be done during mixing, not during the creation of sound, and that is why we don't send anything on the LFE channel, because it's something for the mixer to do later on. Also, if we send something to the LFE, the problem is that there's a lot of people using this with different approaches. Okay, what are the frequencies they are using on the subwoofer? Is they reproducing LFE with plus 10 dBs than the other channels? Yes, no, because if they are not, we're going to give you a worse sound because we are removing things from the other channels, putting in here. So once again, that's why we prefer not to send LFE information here. And then if you want to do a mix in 5.1, or if you have a studio with a subwoofer, then you make sure that you use some kind of bass management to make sure that everything is reproduced as it should. So that's our take on the LFE channel. And then finally we have here the settings. And so let's talk about the settings of the synthesizer. The first thing that you notice here is polyphony, and polyphony means how many notes, how many voices are playing at the same time. So when I play something like this, okay, I'm playing one voice. There is one note that is played. If I play a chord, you see there are 3 notes playing at once. Okay, so in history, from history point of view, on the beginning, the synthesizers were monophonic, which means they would only be able to play one note, and actually that's one of the reasons for the arpeggiators, because it was a matter of creating harmony with something that is only able to play one note at once. Of course, at some point we started to have polyphonic synthesizers where you can get multiple notes, but there is one thing that you need to take into consideration. When it comes to polyphony, a voice doesn't stop just because you release the note, because there is going to be a release phase. So what we are going to do, so imagine the following. Imagine that I have these 3 notes, okay, and now look at this in use value here. So as you can see, I'm simply playing 3 notes, but every time that I release and play back, what happens is that the previous notes are still sounding. I'm still using resources of the synthesizer. There are some voices are still allocated playing the previous notes, and then I'm playing new notes that are assigned to new voices, and that's why even I'm simply using even a single note. Okay, if I start playing something like this. So as you can see, we get up to 6 voices just when this note, because every voice is still doing the release, and the new comes in and continue uses that. So what we have here, it's this max polyphony, and the idea is for us to put a limit on the synthesizer, and this is actually a good thing. So what we do is, okay, we say the synthesizer should only be able to play the first 16 notes, okay, and then what happens is that when there is a new note here and there is already 16 voices being used, what it's going to do is the synthesizer, and it's SkyDust behavior, but pretty much every synthesizer does the exact same thing. What they do is they're going to pick up one note that is older and is already fading down almost, most of the times already releasing almost near silence, and then what we do is we simply fade out that note that is almost inaudible at the moment, and use that voice, still that voice, to use for the new voice. And why we do this? Well, what happens is that this number of polyphony can actually skyrocket very, very fast. For instance, let me give you an example. If I press the sustain pedal and now I start playing something like this. So as you can see, only with a single note with the sustain pedal on, every time that I'm playing, I'm simply adding more and more voices. And if the synthesizers didn't have this kind of protection, what is going to happen is that at some point the synthesizer is going to limit their resources, the CPU, the performance, all of those things, and then start to get glitches. That is something that you don't want. And this is used in every single synthesizer, no matter how light or heavy it is. Most of synthesizers, all of them use this kind of max polyphony. So by default, SkyDust uses a max polyphony of 16 notes per instance, which means that if I have another SkyDust on the different track, it's 16 also to him. And what happens is, okay, the 7th note, it's going to fade out one of the other notes, usually one that is very close to silence. Okay, fade out, people will not notice, and the new note will start. Of course, imagine that you say, now I have a fantastic machine, I only have this track, but I want the full detail, full quality. Well, in that case, feel free to increase these values. SkyDust can go up to 256 in terms of polyphony, okay? But once again, be careful. If you start having multiple instances of SkyDust, because you have multiple tracks with SkyDust there, or any kind of synth, and at some point you start to feel that you start to get glitches, once again, SkyDust or any kind of synthesizer, the idea is come here, reduce the polyphony to make sure that this allows you to get a much more performance without glitches and without most of the times actually affecting the listening experience. Okay, moving forward, next we have the MIDI channel. So MIDI channel, by default, SkyDust listens to MIDI information coming from any kind of MIDI, okay, could be channel 1, 2, 3, blah, 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 all of them, without any worries. If you want to limit SkyDust to one particular channel, you can come in and say, no, I want to listen only on things coming on channel number 2. If they are not coming on channel number 2, I don't want to, I'm going to ignore it, all of that. Also, from SkyDust version 1.1, now you have this new entry called MPE. So what is MPE? Well, it's a new, relatively new standard in terms of MIDI that allows you to use particular keyboards like Rolly or Osmos keyboards, and the idea is to send almost each note to act as a MIDI channel. And this allows you to get even more control, which means that now you can send. With the regular MIDI, you use the pitch bend, and the pitch bend will send information to all the notes that are playing. With MPE, allows you to be able to say, okay, this is the pitch bend information from this note, and the pitch bend information to the other note, completely independent, which means that depending on the keyboard, I could either move the fingers, and each finger will have its own pitch bend, among other things, aftertouch and other behavior. So if you have a keyboard with MPE, like Osmos, Rolly, and many other brands out there, feel free to use them. Make sure that you have this MPE, because in terms of MIDI, it's going to be slightly different. So use that. Finally, in this section, we have this release previous use of MIDI learn. What does this mean? Well, imagine the following. So imagine that at some point I have here, I want to assign one knob of my keyboard to this. Okay, so I have here, so now I have assigned with MIDI learn this knob to this parameter, okay? And now I say, okay, now I want to assign this to that parameter instead. So I do the MIDI learn here, okay, it starts to blink, I control this, and now I forgot the synthesizer, say, okay, I'm assigning that knob not to this, but now to this one. So pretty much every previous use of that MIDI message, it's now been ignored. If by some reason you want to use the same knob to control multiple parameters, okay, my advice would be to use a macro, okay, but if you don't want to use macros and you want to be able to use MIDI learn and assign, for instance, the gain of everything to the same knob or something like that, make sure that you come here and disable this to make sure that when you assign a new MIDI learn, the system automatically don't remove the previous use and continue to assign all of those parameters at the same time. Then we have the pitch bend. So when you talk about the pitch bend, and everyone knows the pitch bend here, okay, so there is a lot of preferences. Some people like to have the pitch bend with 1 octave above, 1 octave below, okay, because you do something like this. Okay, and this great. Sometimes people prefer this with 2 steps above and 2 steps below to simulate things like, for instance, the guitar player that pulls the string and is able to increase up to 2 steps the pitch of the note, and you want to simulate that with the pitch bend. So a lot of people prefer the pitch bend with 2 steps up, 2 steps down. Eventually someone want to do some crazy things and say, no, I want the pitch bend with 3 octaves up, 3 octaves loud to create this kind of sound. So it's up to you. Come here, select the kind of things that you prefer. For instance, sometimes people prefer 1 octave below but 2 steps above. So feel free to change the settings that you prefer for pitch bend. Then we have the tuning. So by default, we use the typical 440 Hz for the A note. If by some reason you are playing SkyDust with some kind of ensemble that use a different kind of tuning, feel free to come here and slightly change the tune of the synthesizer. And also you are able to come here and transpose the settings of SkyDust. For instance, imagine that, okay, you have been playing this song in this scale, but today the singer has the voice, it's not okay, he's not able to reach those notes, and it's important for people to use this in the different transpose, but you don't want to go there and do to play on the different scale, so you can come here and transpose things. So pretty much this means that if you press a C, okay, 0 means you get a C, okay? If you do +1 means that you press a C, but you get a C sharp, or you press a C and you get a D. So we are free to have this transpose happening in here. And then we have the binaural setting. So if you actually come here and use the binaural, then what we're going to do is for us to simulate this 3D sound over headphones, we use something called HRTFs, head-related transfer functions, that tells you that the sound coming from this direction will have this amount of filtering and this amount of delays between channels and so on. So there are multiple data sets in here. By default, we use SADI dataset with the KU100 binaural microphone dataset, but you feel free to come here and choose the one that works better for you, because every person has different ears. Okay, the way that I listen is different from the way that you listen, because we have different ears. So my advice was, if you are interested in try this with binaural, spend some time, come here and try different data sets to see what is the best data set for you. Because sometimes you may have a lot of front to back confusion, sometimes the timbre it's not right, the equalization it's off. So if you come here and lose some time choosing between different settings until you get, okay, now this is the one that works best for me. Also, if by any chance you have your own SOFA file, SOFA it's a kind of file format that's allowed to have your personalized HRTFs, because you were to a university and a quiet chamber recording your own HRTFs, or you have some other way of getting your SOFA file, you can use your personalized data set in here, import that file and simply use that within the synthesizer. Also, at some point, if by some reason you start messing around and you don't know exactly if you have broken anything, simply press reset and everything is going to reset to the default settings. Okay, now let's talk about these panels that we have in the button. Let's keep this one to the to later on because they will need more time. So let's talk about them. So first of all, we have here the pitch bend and the modulation wheel that, of course, if you use your keyboard, they're also going to react. Then we have the keyboard here. Okay, so you can select how many notes do you want to see here at the keyboard, if you want the same as a piano, if you want the 128 MIDI notes that are much more notes than the one on the piano keyboard. So pretty much if whatever you want to see. Also, if you're using a sustained pedal, every time that you press the pedal, you're going to see this bar over here, almost like the bar moving up and down on the piano. So if you press and you see this bar, this means that the sustain, it's down. Then we have the octaves here, so we are able to change the octaves of the synthesizer. And then we have these three buttons here, and these three buttons allow you to disable or enable spatial movement, pitch modifiers, and arpeggiator. So spatial, imagine something like this. So you get the sound moving around. If I want to disable this, so they are not moving. Of course, yes, each note are placed on a different position because of randomness, okay, but they are not moving around. They are, each particle are in a static position. Or if I activate this, I have now movement on the particles. Then the pitch related effects. So if we have something, for instance, like this, but you want this sound without having this kind of pitch effects, you simply disable this, and now you get. Okay, so with no pitch controlled by envelope generators or LFOs or whatever. And then also we have the arpeggiator, so imagine that I have something like. But if I want this without the arpeggiator, simply disable. Okay, without arpeggiator being used. So if you want, once again, enable spatial movement of the particles instead of being static. If you want pitch effects like envelope generated controlled pitch or LFOs controlling pitch for vibrato and those things, to disable them, or the arpeggiator. Finally, we have here on these buttons the legato that can also be the mono and the legato. So what does this mean? Well, by default, the synth is a polyphonic one, which means that you get, let me just put some other note, could be something like this. So it's a polyphonic, okay, but now imagine that I say, no, I want this to be monophonic, which means that you do something like this. And that means that you get only one note being played at once. There is two modes, the mono mode and the legato mode. What are the differences? Well, with mono mode, what happens is that when you play a new note, what it's going to do is automatically going to fire the note off of the previous note and going to trigger the new note, okay? If you are using legato, it's a different kind of thing. What happens with legato is that instead of re-triggering all the envelope generators and all of those things and activating the release on the previous note, what it's going to do is I'm going to continue the exact same note but now changing the pitch. So if the envelope generators are, for instance, already on the sustain phase, they will going to continue there without attack and decays and all of those things. So pretty much instead of having and now in legato, so you change the pitch, but you don't re-trigger the envelope generators and all of those things. When either legato or mono are enabled, you're going to see this knob here called the glide. And the reason for the glide is for you to tell how long do you want the sound to come from the previous note to the new note. So something like this. Or imagine that, so now I want this to be instant. Or imagine that, no, I want this to be quite slow. Okay, so the glide controls the time that goes to one note to reach until from the old note to the new note. Then also we're going to have here the macro, and the idea of the macro is for you to be able to control, it's the same as in here. The idea of macros is to say, okay, I have this parameter, but I want this to control multiple things at the same time. So imagine that you want at the same time to increase the gain of oscillator 1, but at the same time also increase the resonance, but at the same time decrease the frequency cut on oscillator 3. And you can do this on a single knob controlling all of these things. So what you see here, the value that you see here, it's pretty much the one that is over here. So it's the exact same thing, but it's just very easy to move if you are simply using this view. Then we have this, our 3D view that tells us where are the particles, where are the oscillators coming from. So it's, as you can see, each oscillator has a different color, okay? So, and this means the front, here means above your head, this means in the rear, left side, right side, okay? And pretty much these corners represent the position of a 7.1 setup. So in here, you know that is the left, in here you know that is the side surround, in here you know that it's the rear, left rear surround. So, and pretty much what you see here, it's what you get over there. Once again, here you have the volume. Okay, you have the meters over there. And this is the keyboard subpanel. Then we have the mixer, and that is to have a mixer where you control the gain of every single oscillator. And this is great because sometimes you want to better shape the sound. You can come here and say, okay, yeah, let's have something like this. And now you say, no, I want this to be... And you'll be able to control how you want to shape each oscillator. Changing these faders is pretty much the same thing as changing the gains over there, okay, so as you can see. Also, if you want to mute, it's pretty much like disable the oscillators over there, okay. Sometimes you want to do a solo, imagine that you do something like this, but then you want to be able to say, no, I want to listen only to oscillator 1, okay, this is oscillator 1, great. This is oscillator 2, this is oscillator 3, this is oscillator 4, okay, and you are able to, okay, I just want to listen to this oscillator or that oscillator. Also, as you can see, these are the colors of each oscillator, which means that when particles are moving, flying around, you can see which oscillator are we talking about. So in this case, yeah, this orange, it's oscillator 2, so you know what happened. Also in here we have the dry wet of the 4 effects, so pretty much when you do something like this you are controlling the dry wet of each one of these effects. You have a master mute if you want to mute everything in here. You have the fader and the meter like other panels. Then moving forward, here we have the macros, okay, like I mentioned, the idea is to have one knob controlling multiple things. For instance, we have here 4 macros. As you can see, there is multiple things that you can add over here. Imagine that you say, okay, macro C, I want this to also control the detune of oscillator 5, and you add in here. Of course, if you want to remove, simply press this minus sign. If you have multiple parameters, you start to have multiple pages, and then you are able to change between pages to see every single parameter that is being adjusted. And also, if you press one parameter in here, what you're going to happen is you're going to see all of the parameters here. We're going to talk about this in a moment, where you have this curve editor that is able to say, now I want this parameter to control this in a certain way. So macros, they are very helpful. Then we have the pads, and the idea of the pads is I want to be able to change two parameters, okay, at the same time, but using the mouse with slightly different values for each. So imagine that you say, okay, I want to control the frequency of oscillator 1, and at the same time I want to control the resonance of oscillator also 1. Okay, so by doing this you are controlling two parameters at once, and you are able to say, okay, yes, I want more like this. Yeah, this is the point that I want. So you have that. Also, if you want, you can use this snap feature. So if you enable the snap, what happens is that you drag, but then when you release, it's going to jump back to the previous position. If you want, you can change this snap time, okay, and then when you release, it's going to take slightly more time to go there and go to the original position. We have two pads, which means that you can control, for instance, frequency and resonance of oscillator 1, but at the same time you want to control the detune of oscillator 2 and the gain of oscillator 4 on a different path. So you are able to do all of those things. Finally, let's talk about spatial, and when we talk about spatial, the idea is to have these spatial views that give you a better insight to what is happening. Okay, so when you do something like that or something like this, so what is actually happening? So in here we have what we call the 360 view. Okay, the idea in here is to be able to represent everything around you on this rectangle. It's almost the same way that you have planet Earth, that is a sphere, but then you unwrap it to get the map of the Earth. Okay, this is pretty much the same thing. So what we have here, this line, it means the horizontal plane. Okay, so in here you have the center. Okay, pretty much this represents the azimuth. So this is the center, and then the left speaker, and this is completely left, not the left speaker, but 90 degrees left. And then this is the back that, of course, this touches this side of things. Okay, so goes here, back, okay, completely right speaker more or less around here, and then the center again. And then what is above means above this plane. So if I have something here on the top means above my head, and then anything that appears here means that are below the horizontal plane. And some, depending on the formats that you are using, something like Ambisonics, 22.2, they even are able to get speakers below the horizontal plane, for instance in the ground, to get the sense of sound coming from below, and SkyDust is able to reproduce all of those things. So if you see something like this, okay, so only by looking at this you see that sounds start more or less over there, okay, far after the 90 degrees, okay, they move to the front, okay, go back, and then if I release, they move above my head. Then we have these 3D views here. This is a rear view, so imagine a camera on the back looking forward. Okay, so you have this rectangle almost like the screen on the theater. Okay, over here, this is the top, this is the floor, or you have this top view, almost imagine a camera above looking to the ground. So you have the front, the rear, this is the ground over here, so a different kind of perspective. And then we have here the spherical view, so the front, this means above your head, in the rear, the left side and the right side. And here we have what we internally call the dark fader view for obvious reasons, but pretty much allows you still to get a very good sense of what happens in terms of 360, but you also know exactly where are the speakers. So if you want to place a sound on the left speaker, you know exactly where the left speaker is. Something like here, it's more difficult to know exactly where is the left speaker. So this is all the views for you to know what is happening. So pretty much to help you with all of this. Okay, so regarding the bottom bar, you have this help. So pretty much when you have the mouse over some parameter, you're going to see these tooltips appearing with some information about every single one of those controls. Also, we're going to, if there is a new update available, you're going to see around here on the version update flashing, just to tell you that there is a new update available. And if you press help, you're going to have this extra options. You can visit our website, you can go watching some tutorials. Also, you have the manual here. The manual is also on the installer, but it's also available here if you want to jump directly to the manual. And there is this request support that is quite interesting, because if you press here, what is going to happen is that you're going to have this form that allow you to give us ask the questions that you are, the problems that you are talking about, the problems that you have. But the important thing is that automatically send us several information that it's relevant for us. For instance, what is the operating system, what is the machine, what is the version of the plugin, and sometimes this is very helpful because it prevents one additional email going back and forward. Sometimes you don't. There is a lot of emails that we receive that don't tell us if they are using Mac or Windows, or if people are using which digital audio extension, or what is the version of the plugin that it's using. And this is quite important for us to get the information. So if you can use this form, it's better for you because you're helping us to help you much further. Also, we have here the forum goes to the Facebook forum that we have, and the check for updates. If you press here, it's going to say, okay, now that is up to date. But you don't even need to do this automatically. The plugin will automatically do this in background, and if there is something, it's going to appear here. Nonetheless, if you want to make sure, you can check for updates. Okay, so this is the overall information regarding these panels. Now let's go to the main panels. But before going to the main panels, there is some additional information that I want to use you about using the parameter. So when I'm having some parameters, so imagine here that I have this gain. Okay, there are a few things that happen. First, if you double click, you go to the default value of that parameter, or eventually if you use alt click, also the same thing, going to the default. Sometimes you want a more precise fine tuning, so you can use the shift, and if you do this with shift, you can see that now this changes only slightly instead of having a lot. With shift is going to only shift. So sometimes you want to fine tune a parameter because it's a pitch or something, so you use the shift key to do that. Also, if you right click, you're going to see this MIDI learn, which means that, imagine that, okay, I want to use one knob for my keyboard or from a additional key controller that I have to control this. And if you want to do that, just simply say, okay, MIDI learn, it's going to start flashing the yellow, okay, then you move it, and it's what happens, you see this blink it once as green. It means, okay, I have able to identify some MIDI message, and now moving forward, every time that I move the knobs on my keyboard or whatever I'm using, this is automatically assigned. Besides that, of course, we can do the forget all MIDI controls, which means that let's forget about all of this. Also, you can assign this and say, okay, I want this to be controlled by note, which means that depending on the note, it's going to have a lower note, is going to have a lower value for this parameter, higher note is going to be higher value for this. Also, we can control this by velocity, the not on velocity, or even something called not off velocity. Only a few keyboards supports this, but if your keyboard supports the release velocity of the release, if you're releasing softly or if you're removing quite fast, removing the key, you can use that to control a parameter. You can assign a random value in each note. If you know, I want this to be always random for each note. And finally, you have the manual assignment if you say, no, I want this to have this CC to control the knob. So pretty much this is some information about that applies to every single parameter, every single knob that you have on SkyDust. Okay, so let's go back and let's start talking about all of these fantastic panels that we have in here. This is the main panel. This is where you get all of your presets. So you get these presets. As you can see, there are some presets that appear in red, and the reason for that is what we call the templates. Pretty much it's, for instance, in this case, it's the basic sine wave without any kind of fancy features built in, and pretty much it's like your white canvas for you to start painting and creating your preset. So pretty much sometimes you create these presets. It's not a preset that you're going to use as a sound source for playing something, but is a template that's, no, this is my base when I want to create a new preset from scratch. Let's start with these empty templates or very basic templates. So you can create these templates or even you can come here and filter this by templates, and you see all the available templates that you have on your computer. And they have this red color to make sure that you, when you are playing around, instead of saying, oh, this preset is very awful. No, it's not a regular preset. Then what we have here, of course, you have these presets. You can open this if you want to have a larger area with more presets available. Also, as you can see, depending on the type of preset, you have different images. So for keys, you see this keyboard. For sequences related presets, you have these steps. For pads, you have this yoga kind of image. So each image gives you an insight what type of preset we're talking about. Also, you can filter things if you want to show all of them or simply the presets from factory or only the presets that you have made on your computer. Also, you can select this by artists. Imagine they say, okay, now I really like the Loftroom presets or the Yuliolo preset. So you can say, no, show me only the presets that were created by this artist because I really like their presets. And then you can also select things. Imagine that to say, no, I simply want, I simply want the pad. So if you filter by pads, you're going to see only pads in here. So that's what you do to filter things around. Then you have this big 3D view that show what is happening. Okay, so you have information about panning. Once again, front over here, this means above your head, back, left and right. And then you have these buttons that are exactly the same function as this. So when you enable or disable this, you are like enable or disable these buttons over here. And then we have these sub presets, which means that, okay, I'm playing something, I really like this. Okay, so imagine, if I want, I can disable. Okay, no ARP, or eventually I can say, no, let's try different. And try different. Okay, so you can choose different sequences for any kind of reason, or different sub presets for pitch related or spatial related sub presets. Okay, so let's move on, and now let's talk about oscillator. So let's pick up here some additional sound. Okay, so what we have here, this is the summary, which means that you have these 8 oscillators. We know that SkyDust uses 8 oscillators for each note, for each voice. We start by, you can enable and disable this and say, okay, I don't want to use this oscillator. Okay, of course, when you do this, pretty much disactivate the mute on the mixer, so it's exactly the same thing. You select which audio waveform do you want to use for the oscillators. Of course, you have the typical ones, you have some variations of them over here with different kind of sounds. And then we have the noises, white noise, pink noise, brown noise, for some kinds of noise sounds that if you want to use as a source for the oscillator. Then Besides that, what we have here is waveform modifiers that allow you to change the sound. So imagine here, for instance, let me put this as a solo. This is not, okay, let's so oscillator 5. So let's here to oscillator 5, okay, solo, oscillator 5. So we have here multiple things, so you can have this silence. Okay, or you can have amplitude offset, and okay, or you could have things like wave folding, okay, that creates this kind of, okay, another wave folding. You have things like clipping, more like a square-like kind of sound. You have, of course, with crunch. Okay, if you want to use big crunch over here, and then we have shifting of time, or eventually if you want to use this as a pulse modulation, okay, pulse width modulation, you can use this. So you have these waveform modifiers. On the pop-up you select the modifiers, and then on the slider you say how much, the amount of that modifier that you want to apply. And this is quite important, especially because you can start with very basic waveforms, and then this creates, gives much more personality to all of those sounds. Then, of course, we have the gains here, where you control the gain of every single oscillator. Once again, it's the same thing as the fader here on the mixer. And then we have here the octaves that you can use. So, for instance, imagine that I'm going to this basic sine. Okay, so, okay, we can also have transpose. Imagine that you want like a fifth applied, that we have an oscillator at 0, another one at +7 to get a fifth out of it. And of course you have also the detune that you can use to change, slightly detune the oscillator. So you have everything here, but then there is some additional information. This is the summary. You can then go for every oscillator and go, okay, oscillator 1 I have here. We still have the same things here, the waves, the octave, transpose, detone, the gain, everything, it's there. Nonetheless, what you're going to see here, it's the envelope generator controlling gain and an LFO controlling gain. So an envelope generator, pretty much, you have this, okay, imagine that you want an attack time. Okay, you also have the release. Okay, so you can control all of those things. Of course, there are, as you can see, there are multiple types of envelope generators. There is the attack release, pretty much attacks and automatically releases after reaching the attack point. And then you have also more complex things, like for instance this delay that has additional delay, which means that the oscillator will not start immediately, has some delay. Then we have some attack. You may have an hold position, holding the note, and then we have the decay, the sustain, and the release. So if you want a more complex kind of envelope generators, you can use them like that. Also, at the same time, we have the LFOs here that allows you to control LFO controlling gain, which means you're going to see there are other envelope generators and other LFOs controlling things like pitch and filters and spatial information and any other thing, any other parameter that you want. This is something that is automatically controlling gain for you to use. So regarding this, so once again, let me go back to the typical one. Let's reduce here this, and okay, so what we have here is this sine. Imagine that you say, okay, I want noise steps, and what is going to happen is that you're going to start having a sound that is being controlled by the LFO in here. So what we have here in terms of parameters? Well, you get the rate. Okay, so how faster or slower you want this LFO to be controlled. Okay, also going to have the depth if you want this to affect more or simply slightly. Okay, also another thing that we have here, it's the delay, which means that do you want the LFO to automatically kick in when the note starts, or if you want like a ramp time for him to go from like a depth of 0 and simply increasing the depth until the value that's here on the knob, and at the same time to slightly accelerate the rate. So instead of having this, okay, imagine that you say, now I want this to take some time to reach that value. Also, you have here a phase. Imagine that to say, okay, I don't want this to start in here with this going up and down. I want this to automatically start in a going down kind of thing without delay. So which means that, okay, you can control this phase where you want to start. I want to start now. I want to start automatically going down, for instance. Also, there is these two buttons. The sync means that the tempo, instead of the time of the LFO, instead of having this 3 Hz, 1 Hz, what you can do is, now let's sync this with the tempo of the workstation, and now we're going to have this as note. So imagine that to say, now I want this to be a quarter note. Okay, the LFO have a duration of a quarter note of the workstation, which means that if you start changing the tempo on your workstation, what is going to happen is that this automatically will follow. So if it goes faster on the workstation, the LFO will also go faster and be perfectly in sync with the tempo that is defined on the workstation. Finally, there is here some global checkbox, which means that by default each LFO, as it is with this disable, it's going to be triggered by each note. So I press a note and the LFO of that note is going to start on that position, and then I press another note and the new LFO is kicking in, also starting by that second note. If you do something like this, what is going to happen is that all the LFOs of oscillator 1 for gain are going to be perfectly in sync between them. So they are not being triggered every time that a note is pressed. They are always in sync one with the other, and this could be interesting because imagine that, now I want to make sure that when you get this kind of sound, for instance, if it is on the pitch, controlling an LFO, controlling pitch, I want the vibrato to be always in sync with every single note. So sometimes it could be interesting for you to have this global, which means that all LFOs from all notes are going to be in sync with each other. Okay, also just in terms of signs, the waveform modifiers is pretty much the same thing as we have before on the oscillators. In here, what is different is that now you have these noise steps, okay, that creates noise but in a step, so like jumping from value to value. There is another one that is linear, almost like going up and down with this kind of lines between values, and then we have this curve. If you want a more kind of curvy behavior, it's still random, going to random values, but with a more curve kind of smooth kind of way. And then we have binary noise that pretty much is only 2 possible values and jumping between 2 possible values. So it's like step, but going to the extreme. Okay, so now that we have this, let's move to the filters. Okay, so now we are on the filter panel. This is where you control all the filters. If you are using subtractive synthesis filter as a fundamental role over there, the idea is to start with waves with a lot of harmonics like square or sawth, and then you start using filters to remove the things that you don't want to use. So in here we have 3 modes. So the first mode, it's off, and you say, no, I don't want to use any kind of filter for this preset, so we ignore all of that. Then we have the global, which means that, okay, yes, I'm going to have this filter, and this filter is applied with the exact same settings for every single oscillator, or if you want the maximum flexibility, you can set filters, different filters for each oscillator. So now oscillator 1 has a filter like this, oscillator 2 has a different kind of filter, 3 another filter, and so on. So when you're using the filter, first you decide, okay, which filter do you want to use? Most of the times in synthesis we use a low-pass filters. Pretty much what you want to do is have the fundamental and the first harmonics and then remove the later harmonics, because sometimes you don't want a very bright sound, so pretty much you start removing the high harmonics. So most of the times you use a low-pass filter with a low-pass, and depending on the filter you can also use the slope here if you want something that is start removing the harmonics quite fast and say no, start removing everything quite fast, I don't want high harmonics. Or if you want a more smooth kind of behavior and say no, let's continue and then let's have this to have a much more smoother response later on. In here, of course, you can control the frequency. I'm simply going to increase here for it's more interesting to see. So you have this filter around here. You say where you want the filter to start, from which frequency do you want this to start being applied. You can also add some resonance, which means that it's going to add some, before starting to attenuate a frequencies, they're going to boost a frequency before attenuating. This could be something, sometimes it's interesting because a very interesting sound over the sound that you want to do. This is a low pass. Of course, we have also high pass filters. This is exactly the opposite, removes low frequency and only passes the high frequencies, pretty much the same controls. You have the band pass, and the band pass you can say, okay, I simply want to allow one band to pass through the filter, so pretty much you have something like this. Okay, then we have the semi-parametric band, like you have a gain up and down. Okay, and then you control which frequency you want this to apply. You have the parametric that allows you to also use this key factor to change if you want this to be very narrow and only remove this band, or if you want to be more open, so you can reduce or boost a particular region and which frequency you want this to apply. And then finally you have the shelving. Pretty much you have the filter and then you have a boost or a cut. Okay, and you say no, you are changing the low frequencies, okay, but as a shelf instead of being a peak. And the same thing with the high. So with the high, it's the opposite. It's you control the high frequencies if you want to boost them or cut the high frequencies over there. Also, regarding here, you're going to see these two buttons. Okay, so for instance, let me put this in as a low-pass filter, something like this. Imagine that, okay, this is around 1 kilohertz. So what happens? By default, with this this switch disabled, what happens is that you apply this filter at 1 kilohertz, and this means that it's going to be 1 kilohertz for every single note. So it doesn't matter if you play a low note or a high note, it's going to always filter by 1 kilohertz. Okay, if you enable the keyboard mapping, okay, and if you start putting this at the higher slider, what is happening is that now the filter depends on the note that you are playing. Yes, for a middle C it's 1 kilohertz, but if you press, for instance, a C note that is 1 octave below, what happens is that the filter also is going to reduce 1 octave to the current value. So currently it's 1 kilohertz, so 1 octave below it's 500. And if you play the C 1 octave above middle C, it's going to move the filter for 2 kilohertz. So pretty much the decision is, okay, do you want the filter to be static and work more like a formant kind of filter, or do you want this to keep moving to the notes to make sure that the timbre it's pretty much the same in all notes. So it's a decision that you can do. And then of course you can go for an in-between situation. For instance, imagine it's something like this. What happens is that if I'm playing 2 octaves, a note 2 octaves below middle C, the filter will only go 1 octave below. So it's like in-between kind of value. So try this. Sometimes it could be interesting for you to fine-tune this for the middle C note, say, and then use this to see the other ranges on low and high if you get the desired behavior that we want with the filter. Then we also have this velocity mapping. So by default, the filter is not affected by the velocity of the note when you're playing the dynamics of the note, if it is piano or fortissimo, those kinds of things. If you want, sometimes what happens is that you want a note that is softer to have less brightness, okay, and if you play something very fast, very high dynamic kind of note, then you have a lot of brightness. So what we can do is you use this velocity mapping, and if you enable this and you go to the maximum velocity, which means is that if you play a note very fast with a high velocity, what is going to happen is it's going to open the filter and pass all the harmonics, it's going to be a much more brighter kind of sound, and then if you play a note very soft, it's going to remove all these harmonics and you get a note very soft, and sometimes even too soft in terms of the filter, that could be even almost inaudible. Okay, so you can control this for you to say, okay, how do I want this filter to react in terms of MIDI velocity. Okay, moving forward, also, a lot of times we want to use an envelope generator to control the filter. A lot of times what we want is you play a note and you want the filter initially to open to make sure that you start with a very bright sound, and then you want to remove the filter to reduce the frequency of the filter to allow the sustain to be a more mellow kind of thing. So bright in the attack and then mellow on the sustained part of it. So you can do something like this in here. Imagine that you say, okay, I want this to start the filter completely closed, tracks to a very completely open. I can say, okay, it's like half a second until going there, and then it's going to decay, okay, and for instance, I want the filter to sustain as it is defined over here, and then on release, do you want to open and get bright, or you want to close and get even mellow, or simply continue with the same settings in terms of the filter. So pretty much it's like a typical DSR, the typical envelope generator. Once again, we have different kinds of envelope generators. The only thing is that now, besides the attack time, decays, sustain and release, you also get what is the starting position of the filter, the attack position of the filter, and all of those things that you can do. Also, you can use the LFO to control the filter, so if you want the frequency of the filter to be oscillating in a particular way, you can also do this with the LFO, pretty much the same settings that we have seen before for the filters. Moving next, now we have FM, frequency modulation. So you can use this with subtractive, with filters. You can use this with FM, and with FM, the idea is to use oscillators that are all modulating other oscillators, and by doing this you get a different kind of sound. So pretty much what you're going to do here is, by default, every oscillator is connected with the output, as you see over here, okay? But now imagine that you say, okay, now I want oscillator 2 to also modulate oscillator 1, which means that now oscillator 2 is also modulating oscillator 1. Eventually, it's also outputting its value. If you want, you can simply say, now I want this to only modulate oscillator 2. And now imagine that you say, okay, and I want oscillator 4 to modulate oscillator 3 and not outputting this. So, and then you can say, now I want oscillator 8 to modulate 3 or modulating 4 and modulating also 2, not outputting. So there is a lot of connections that you can do. Every time that you have one oscillator modulating another one, you get usually much more bright with much more frequency content. Of course, if you start modulating everything one after the other, almost something like this, most likely you get a very noisy kind of sound. Sometimes it's not that what you are looking for. So this would be a very strange kind of sound, but nonetheless you are able to do this kind of connections as you may like. Of course, once again, you have here multiple presets of FM that you can automatically use for your sound. So as you connect this, of course, one of the things that we do is we're not able to modulate, for instance, one modulating its own. We're going to have, you can use with feedback, but that's a different choice. And so pretty much what you can do is only this bottom half of this matrix that allows you to modulate things. So for instance, oscillator 5 can modulate 1 to 4, but cannot modulate 6, 7, and 8, just to prevent loops and other things that could ruin your preset. Okay, so each oscillator may have its own setting, so pretty much you can say that, okay, the oscillator has a fixed frequency, sometimes with FEM, usually not the ones that are connected to the output, but the ones that are oscillating. For instance, in this case, it doesn't make sense to do this for 1, but it could make sense to do this for 3 and say, okay, I want this to be a fixed frequency. In this case, the ratio changes to a fixed frequency in hertz, where you say, no, this is I don't want this oscillator to look at the note, simply use this as a fixed frequency. If this is disabled, then you can use the ratio, and you can say, okay, this is the ratio, is like a kind of a pitch shifting. If you want to say, okay, 1 means at the same value, 2 means that is one octave above, 0.5 it's 1 octave below. So if you are used to use FM synthesis, you know exactly the ratio, but pretty much it's like changing the octave and transpose or detune of the oscillator regarding the note. Then we also have this detune that you can use here to make some detuned on the oscillator. Also you have feedback, which means that the oscillator it's also modulating himself, and by doing this you get also more bright kind of sound. Could be interesting and sometimes. And then also what is the modulation gain, which means it's the gain, but what is different between the regular gain is that this gain when is used for modulating another oscillator, sometimes you want very crazy gains. For instance, we go up to 40 dBs plus 40 dBs of gain. That of course you would not want this in a regular moving out of the interface, because it's going to clip automatically. But when you are modulating another oscillator, this could be quite interesting. And of course you can use this for all the other oscillators that we have here on the screen. Okay, moving forward, now let's move to the pitch. Once again, there are 3 modes on pitch. With pitch disabled means that, okay, pretty much the note controls everything and there is no pitch variations whatsoever. You can go for the global, which means that in global means that you are having an envelope generator and eventually an LFO controlling pitch, but with the same settings for every single oscillator. Or, of course, once again, you can have settings by oscillators. So, yes, once again, you have the octave transpose and detune like we have on the oscillators, exactly the same knobs controlling exactly the same thing. What you can do, well, sometimes you want the envelope generator to change the pitch. Imagine that you want to play a note, but I want the note to start 1 octave below and start increasing to the note that I'm playing. So, for instance, with something like this, so as you can see, we have this envelope generated with notes starting in different positions and moving to particular things. So how does it help? Once again, does it work? Once again, you can choose multiple types of envelope generators, but what you do is, okay, what is the starting position? So in this case, I'm saying, okay, I want this oscillator to start 2 octaves below, okay, then attacks to a certain value. In this case, the attack value is still 17 steps below the current note. Okay, it will take 2.5 seconds reaching that position, and then sustained to 1 octave below. So in this case, what happens is that it's going to keep 1 octave below. Okay, and then on release will continue sounding 1 octave below. Okay, and then you have the times that you want to reach the attack, the times that you want to reach sustain, and then the times that you want to release. In this case, it's irrelevant because it's going to keep the same value, so you can control it. Imagine that, okay, I want to play something, but I want to, or eventually you want the note to sound okay, going up and down, so you can control everything with this. Also, you may notice there is this random value here. This random, what means is that instead of having 2 octaves, okay, like we have here, if I press random, what happens is now each note is going to have a random value for this starting position. So they still going to attack to the same value, but they start in the random position. And the exact behavior depends on this, so pretty much if you have fixed means that this it's ignore, it's what is on the knobs. If you have 0 to value means that it ranges between 0 and the value, in this case between 0 and -2 octaves. If it is minus value to value means that it ranges, okay, this is 2 octaves, so it's from -2 octaves to +2 octaves, so it could be anything between -2 and +2. Or eventually you could say, no, it's simply some detune, 110 cents of variation maximum between this, so a slight detune or a slightly more heavy detune over here, or simply 2 octaves, and I don't care what value you write here, it's a random value of -2 to +2 octaves. Anything in the middle can happen. Once again, try. Sometimes you can get some interesting effects. Also, we have the LFO, and this is used a lot because this is what gives you the vibrato kind of feeling that you want. Once again, you can choose the multiple waves that you want for vibrato. Most people use the sine wave, but you can use other things. Waveform modifiers, like the typical thing like we've seen so far, okay, the rate, the depth, okay, now the depth of course is in steps, so if you want a slight delay you probably want only a few cents, not a few steps, unless you want some crazy sound that starts creating something completely crazy, but most of the times you don't want something like that. Now let's move to Spatial, and of course Spatial it's quite interesting because as you know, Spatial it's one of the major features of SkyDust. So when you talk about space, there are once again 3 modes over here, as you can see for these 3 buttons. You have off, which means that there is no movement. Yes, you are still having spatial sound, but the oscillators are not moving around. And with this mode, pretty much you have to say is, okay, oscillator 1, I want oscillator 1 to be, for instance, in the center, and I want 2 to be on the left, and 3 to be on the right, and 4 to be above my head. So you select where you want the sound of each oscillator to be position, or imagine that now I want everything coming here on the front, so pretty much you select everything coming here somewhere between left and right, okay. Also you can see there is this slider, and this what it does is create some randomness, which means that if you put something like this, oscillator 1 will always be at the center channel. If you add something like this, what happens is that every note that you play, it's going to be in a slightly random position, more or less on that area. Or if you want, no, I want every note that I play to be always in a random position. So as you can see, the yellows are here everywhere. So you can create some randomness, okay, how much randomness you want. We call them diversions, but that's you can define this for every single oscillator. Nonetheless, in this mode, in the off mode, each oscillator is starting on the position, okay. Yes, it may be a different position for each note if you have the diversions, but it's going to be static, things are not moving around. If you want them to move around, there are 2 possibilities. One of them is to use an envelope generator. Once again, it could be a global, which means that all oscillators are doing the exact same thing, or it could be by oscillator. You say, no, I want oscillator 1 to have a certain thing. And now imagine the following. Imagine that you say, okay, I want oscillator 1 to start in the back, attacks to the center, holds, sustains in the left, and then releases above my head. And then I want the moving from the left to the attack position to the center to be like a quarter of a second, and then going to sustain to be more or less 1 second to go from center to left, and then when the release is to be quite fast and releases above my head. So you can, and this is only one oscillator. You can do oscillator to the opposite thing. Oscillator 3 starts above me and go to the back. The oscillator 4 starts in the side and going to the other side. So you can create this amazing movement on a single note with a lot of things happening. And that is, of course, fantastic. At the same time, if you want, you can also use an LFO to control panning. Okay, and by doing this, for instance, something like this, okay, you can do. Okay, so in this case you have sound jumping around. What we have here, well, pretty much we have this LFO with noise steps, and pretty much the steps are controlling azimuth. So as you can see now, instead of 1 depth, you're going to have 3. This means that the depth is changing the azimuth, which means that azimuth means this. Okay, so if you want this to change the azimuth around you, or if you want this to control elevation, so and start elevating the sound, moving the elevation, or eventually the distance, which means that if you start adding the distance, what happens is that instead of having the sound on the speaker, pretty much you are bringing it to the central position, to the listening position, and pretty much when it's on the speaker, there is 1 speaker, or eventually 2 or 3, depending if it is a high kind of a signal. Okay, when you bring to the listening position, pretty much what you're going to have is to have all speakers playing the exact same sound, like a big mono sound. But this with an LFO could be interesting, between 1 speaker and all speakers, 1 speaker, all speakers. So this nonetheless could be quite interesting way of doing things. Finally, there is another approach that we call movement modifiers. And the idea is, okay, you define what is your starting position. Once again, could be global or could be by oscillator. Imagine that I say, okay, I want this oscillator 1 to start, for instance, on the left. Okay, I want some randomness, okay, not only exactly left, but somewhere over there. And then, okay, when it's moving, I choose a pattern. And what kind of movement do you want? Well, imagine that I say, okay, I want this to start rotating around, or I want this to move up, or I want this to oscillate, or I want the things to be floating around, okay, within a certain area. So pretty much you have all of those things that you can control. So you choose the pattern that you want, and then depending on the pattern you have knobs to control different things. Okay, so in here, the floating, you have this azimuth and elevation to define more or less if you want this to float only around or moving up and down, if you want the floating to be completely around you or simply a certain area, and then the depth if you want the floating to be more faster or slower, or if it is a rotation, if you want the rotation to be faster on azimuth or in the elevation. So you can control all of those things. And then finally, you have the release, how you want the release. After you release the note, what is going to happen in terms of space. If you want to go to a final position, so imagine that's, okay, I want all sounds to finish in the back with some randomness. Okay, so pretty much when I release the note, everything goes to the back. Or eventually I can have a different pattern and say, no, this sound, it's for instance floating around, okay, but then when I release, I want the notes to start rotating fast around me. So there is a lot of things that you can do and create this amazing space. Even if you're only using stereo, this can bring very interesting results even in stereo. Okay, moving forward, and now let's talk about the arpeggiator. So the arpeggiator, there is, when you talk about arpeggiator, usually we are talking about 2 different features. One of them is the actual arpeggiator and the other is the sequencer. What are the different? Well, in here it's off. Once again, there is 3 modes. Let me put a different kind of sound. Okay, let's have this sound. So by default I have this. Okay, so I press a note. Let me put in here in keys for us too. Okay, I'm pressing, and pretty much I'm listening to what I'm playing. Okay, when you activate the arpeggiator, what happens is that the idea is, okay, I play multiple notes, but what the software is going to do is to simply play one note at a time, creating an arpeggio. So let me start by doing something like this. Okay, so I play these 3 notes. Okay, so what we have here? Well, we have here the speed. Okay, eventually if you want you can sync this with the host, once again using the tempo from your workstation to say, okay, I want this to be, each note to be a quarter or a eighth or something, okay. But once again you have the pattern, okay, so imagine that I'm playing this 5 note or something like this. Or eventually like this. So pretty much you have different patterns that you can choose, and then what you can do is here is to add multiple notes besides the ones that you are playing. So at 0 pretty much you still, so let's start with this. Eventually if I do something like this, I'm going to add not only these notes but also all these notes 1 octave above, so you get this. So you get additional notes. I can even add more notes 2 octaves above or even below. So the idea is, okay, you play multiple notes and then you get arpeggios coming out of it. Eventually you can even press everything. Okay, so this is the arpeggiator, but now there is another thing called the sequencer. The idea of the sequencer, it's the opposite. You press 1 note and then you get an arpeggio based on the first note that you play. So usually most synthesizers have something like this, which means that you play a note. And now if you say, okay, let's do some crazy things over here. Okay, so pretty much what happens is I'm playing a note and it knows, okay, the first note should play with the exact same pitch. This should play 4 steps above what is the current note. This should play 5 steps below the current note. And then if I choose a different note, okay, so this is the typical sequencers that you get on synth. Of course, you can disable a few steps and say, no, I don't want this to happen. Okay, so you can enable or disable some of the steps that you can use. You can use this to add more steps, and if you need a lot of steps, you can even have multiple pages. So here you have the first 16, and then here you get from 17 to 22. So if you need more steps, you can do something like this. So let's reduce once again. What we have here, once again, we also have the speed. Okay. Once again, you can also sync this with the tempo and use the tempo of the host to control the speed of what is playing. What you can do here more, well, although most synths use this kind of pitch bars where you say how much variates for each step. For me, it doesn't feel quite right, because sometimes you want to jump for that note and you start, okay, that note, how many steps it is to reach that note. So what we decided, okay, let's simply put this as a keyboard, and you say, okay, this is the C note over there, this middle note represents the note that I'm playing. So pretty much you get this, and it's more easily for to say, okay, I want to do something like this. Okay, and it's more easily for you to simply enter the notes and creating the arpeggio that you are looking for. Also, and since we are now using this as a keyboard, the question is, why does this need to be monophonic? Okay, it doesn't. So yes, historically synthesizers used this because on the old days, synthesizers were monophonic. They will only be able to play one note at a time. So this was a very clever way of creating harmonies and with that. But that's why you can use this in polymode. With polymode, pretty much means that you can now each step have more than one note, and you say, okay, I want this to do like this and create a much more interesting result. Okay, so now you can have this. Okay, let's remove this just to be. Okay, so why not creating arpeggios but with multiple notes instead of simply one at a time? Also, in here you can change the range of things. So by default you have one octave above and one octave below the note that you are playing. If you want, you can say, now I want this to have 2 octaves above and 2 octaves below, because I want to create these crazy arpeggios or glissandos that creates goes from a very low note to a very high note, and you can say, no, I want this to be over here and also that note to be over there, so you get. Okay, or eventually you can even go crazy and have 3 octaves above and 3 octaves below. So once again, multiple things can happen over here. Then one thing that, as you can see, by default the reference note, it's a C, which means that C means 0, which means that is the note that you are playing. Yes, in this case, if I play a C, I'm going to listen to a C, an E, and a G. Okay, if I press a C sharp, what is going to play is this note is actually a C sharp, this note is actually an F, and this is actually a G sharp. But eventually, sometimes you can say, no, I'm working on a different scale, so I want the reference to be in a different scale. So now, for instance, D, it's the reference note, so what appears here as the 0 offset in terms of pitch. But it's only a matter, it's only visual, it continues to sound exactly the same, okay? Okay, because it's the note that you're playing that actually represents what you are moving around. Finally, there is this 4 scale, and what is the reason for this? Well, imagine the following. Imagine that, okay, I'm playing a song, okay, this is a C major, and then I'm going for a F. Okay, it's, as you can see, it's a major arpeggio, so C major, F major, G major, but now imagine that I want an A, and what it's going to do is, because it's a major arpeggio, it's going to go to A major, so get. Okay, but most likely, most of the songs, if you are using a scale that is C major, probably what we would want is an A minor over there. So what you can do is make the sequences slightly more smarter and say, no, I'm using a C major. So adapt this to make sure that all the notes continue to be in the C major scale. So pretty much I have C, it's major, F, it's major, G, it's major, but then A, it's minor. Okay, so the sequencer automatically adapts to the note that you are playing to make sure that you are following this scale. So Okay, so if you are simply telling the sequencer, okay, please force this scale and then adapt. So sometimes it knows when it's going to be a major, what is going to be a minor, automatically based on that information. Well, we are talking about the sequencer, but the sequencer, what we have here, yes, we can sequence these notes, create this sequence of notes, but we can also add parameters. For instance, one of those parameters, of course, it's spanning. So you can almost say, I want these notes to start to play there, these notes over here, this note, this E over here, it's above my head, this is going to be in the back, and now I'm creating a 3D arpeggio. I'm playing something, but so you get this kind of arpeggios, but in 3D, which is a lot of fun. Finally, although we are doing this, you can also continue adding new parameters. Every single parameter of the synthesizer can also be put it on the sequencer. So imagine that you say, okay, I want the wave modifier of oscillator 2 to also be here. So now I'm controlling how the filter should use each one of those steps, how this should actually be animated through time. And you can continue adding more parameters as you want: pitch, spatial, FM, filter, and many others. So sequencer, it's a very interesting way for you to create a lot of things and animate them, and it's a lot of fun. Okay, now let's talk about effects. So in terms of effects, we have here 4 slots that allow you to put 4 effects over here. We have delay, reverb. We can also have bit crash, distortion, or an equalizer in the final buzz after the render of everything it's been done. So with the delay also, in each one of them you have the sub presets only of delay, so different presets that were created here for the delay. Of course, we have the time of the delay, you have the gain of the delay, the feedback, so you can control all of those things. Also, we have the reverb pretty much with depth and room size, with some presets that you can use. So pretty much the room size gives you the size of the room that you want to simulate. The damp will allow you to control how do you want the high frequencies, the reverberation in terms of high frequencies, if you want also a lot of reverberation on the high frequencies, or starts to reduce these high frequencies as start to jumping, moving, because they are attenuated by air, and also usually they are attenuated much faster when they are having a reflection. And then we have the width, which means that if you want pretty much the reverb coming from the current channel, or if you want that sound to also affect the sound that is sent to the other side of the reverb. Then we're going to have bit crunch. So in bit crunch, once again, you have here the number of bits. Okay, and this is great for if you are looking for that kind of 8-bit kind of sound of the 80s. Sometimes if you go very hard on the number of the bits, the signal may need some gain, because eventually if the signal is not enough to trigger the next interval of the bit crunch, you get only silence. So sometimes you need this pre-gain to get some additional gain over there. Of course, you can press here to remove the current preset. Then you can have the distortion. In this case, we have a more hard clipping or a slight overdrive. We have here the pre-gain and output gain. And then we also have the equalizer that can have either 3 bands, okay, low, mid, and high, or you can act as a parametric and you say, now this is the frequency, this is the key, and this is the gain that you want to use. For each effect, you're going to have the dry wet. If you want things to have more dry, only the original ones, and pretty much no effect whatsoever. If you don't want original and simply want the output coming out of here, or if you want something in the middle. And then you're also going to have meters after each one of these effects for you to actually know what is happening with your mix. Then we're going to have extra. So as we've seen, we have already envelope generators and LFOs in a lot of things. We have on the oscillator, we have envelope generators and LFOs controlling gains, on the filters controlling filters, on the pitch controlling pitch, on the spatial controlling spatial. Nonetheless, besides all of those envelope generators and LFOs, in here you have 8 extra envelope generators and 8 extra LFOs that allow you to use this to control whatever you want. So imagine, for instance, that you want an LFO, okay, to control the waveform modifier of oscillator number 2. Okay, so now you are able to get any LFO here to controlling parameters, any kind of parameter of the scene. So pretty much, yes, you have these predefined things that are there because most of the time you are going to use them, okay, and to simplify your life, it's on those places, on the filter, on the pitch, whatsoever. But in here you can create something to control one parameter that you want, or if you want, you can even continue adding and say, now at the same time, I want this to also change the waveform modifier of oscillator 5, but I want to also control some azimuth offset of everything. So you can use the same LFO to control a bunch of different parameters. What happens is that now you have a curve editor here, and the curve editor means, okay, how do you want that parameter, in this case the LFO, to control the waveform modifier or anything else. So, for instance, imagine that you say, okay, I want when the modifier of oscillator 5 goes up, okay, I want the modifier of oscillator to move down. So pretty much having one modifier and the other modifier, so doing something like this. So you can, of course, in any point you can simply press this button that resets to this single line, okay? You can invert and simply invert what is currently there. You can control these handlers to decide now what should happen over here. If you want, you can even control this curve with this handler, okay, how this curve should be control the relation between them. If you want, you can even add more control points to create a crazy thing, because you want the LFO but to have a strange behavior controlling that parameter. If you want to add more points, simply double click. If you want to remove them, it's only a matter of dragging them outside, and by dragging them outside it's going to move away. Okay, so you move aside, they go away, you return, they are there. Okay, so if I want to remove this, it's simply a matter of dragging this outside and they move away. So everything over there. Also, when you are changing something, it gives you information over here about what is the parameter. So the first number represents the X, the input. So when you get this value of 1 from here, what should be the output over here? So you can control all of those things happening. Also, in here, if you want to simply reduce the depth of what is being affected, you can simply use this, and pretty much this creates a smooth version with the same curve but smoother. Okay, sometimes you may want, now I want to the maximum, it's right, but I simply want the minimum to change, or you want the maximum to change and keep the minimum, or simply want to offset everything and use this mid parameter. So you can control all of those things coming out of here. Finally, let's talk about the matrix, because it's a very powerful thing that you can use to control the sound, to use external controllers like keyboards and MIDI information. So usually this is where you say, okay, I want this parameter to control that parameter. For instance, in here we have, okay, modulation wheel is controlling macro A, which means that when I'm changing the modulation wheel, actually what happens is that if you come here to the macros, as you can see, I'm changing the modulation wheel, and you see macro A being set over here. Also, what happens is sometimes we have a lot of information in here. Okay, so what you can do is filter only a few. So imagine say, okay, show me only things that are being controlled by MIDI, and you get this, or things that are being controlled by macros, or things that are controlled by the extra envelope generators or LFO. In this case, only LFO1 it's being controlled. That's what we have just set. Okay, or eventually by destination. You want to say, okay, is there anything here controlling pitch? No. And controlling spatial? No. And controlling filters? No. And controlling oscillators? Okay, yes, oscillators, there is a bunch of things happening oscillators. So if you want to filter things out, you can filter using these tabs over here. So what we have here, of course, if you want to add one additional control, you simply press the plus. If you want to remove one of these, you simply select and press the recycle bin, and this is been removed. Also, what you see here on this, it's a thumbnail of the curve editors for you to know exactly what is happening with each one of them. And so imagine that for instance, in here we can see that you have, okay, you have not on velocity, okay, that is controlling the gain of everything. So pretty much modulation wheel controlling macro, and then the not on velocity also is controlling the gain. Okay, it's only slightly controlling gain, but it's still controlling gain. So making sure that if you press harder or softer, you get different kind of gains coming out of the synth. Also, at any point you can disable a few things without removing them. So say, okay, let me remove this to see what this do. Okay, now I see. So you can enable and disable. And then there is, in here, the curve editor we have already seen on the extras how to manage with this. So if you are jumping directly to this section, please look at the extras to get a little better, more insight about the curve editor. And then finally there is this option of set and offset that could be slightly trickier to understand. So pretty much when you have one parameter controlling something on the synth, there is two possible situations. One of them is to simply say, okay, I want absolute control about this parameter. And you say, no, I don't care anything else. I'm the only thing that is controlling this. The second thing is you're saying, no, it's offset. I simply want to make a slight variation on the values that is automatically there. For instance, imagine something like the filter of that I set here. So imagine the user was here, they say, okay, I want the filter with a frequency of 100 Hertz, okay? And now you say, okay, but I also want modulation wheel to change that filter. Okay, so what do you want to happen? Do you want the modulation wheel to make some slightly changes there, and then it's definitely an offset? Or you simply say, no, ignore what is coming from the knob that says filter. I'm simply using modulation wheel to control always this. So the position of the wheel controlling the filter and nothing else is being controlling this frequency of the filter. So, and this clearly a set. So you use a set if you say, no, I want to have absolute control of this parameter, anything else should not be able to control this parameter. Or you use an offset if you say, no, I want this to make some slight variation, slightly increasing and slightly decreasing the current value that is automatically there because it's from the knob or coming from the envelope generator of the filter or anything else. So pretty much you are having these two possibilities, set and offset, depending what the things that you want to do. And that's a very short, long, but short presentation of all the features, all the knobs, all the parameters of the synth. Yes, I would like to have more time and spend more time for you with more audio examples for you to see what is happening in each knob, but then the video would not be 1 hour, would be of 8 hours or so. Nonetheless, I hope this helped you understand every single parameter. Once again, you don't have to see the entire video, you could simply jump to certain sections that you want to know more. And I really hope that you have a lot of fun with SkyDust as we have been creating it and testing it. So once again, see you on the next video.